Welcome to the Power Curve. I'm Holly Scott. In our podcast, I have the opportunity to chat with accomplished executives regarding pivotal decisions they've made along their career path with the idea of empowering you, our audience, as you navigate your own career trajectory. I'm thrilled today to have Lori Chmura with us, the CEO of Soundbite Medical. Soundbite is an innovative medical device company that is focused on a significant problem in the cardiovascular market, and that's chronic total occlusion. So thank you, Lori, for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Excellent. Yes, Lori started her career as an ER nurse and a critical care nurse. So as we think about you aspiring to now your second C-level role in the industry, I would love to hear how you got into the space. Back to your academic foundation, how did you, what were the roots that brought you to nursing and to the clinical side, and especially that front line in ER critical care, right? That's the tip of the spear.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually, I always kind of start with how I was brought up because I think it's a really important component of who I am and how I made the decision. So I had a wonderfully supportive family, but first generation Italian, post-World War II, Depression, very old school conservative, oldest of three girls. And, girls didn't go to college in those days. Mm-hmm. And so my mom was real active in politics and different stuff. So she was supportive, but my dad just kind of didn't understand it. So in order for me to compel them to allow me to go to college, I had to figure out kind of a girl job. And so, from the time I was young, I thought, well, nursing's kind of a girl job. You can do that and still have a family and do the things that are expected. And so, when I applied to school, I had to go, I had requirements. I had to be no more than 45 minutes from home. It couldn't be expensive. There was a lot of requirements in that. And so, so I went to this small state school, and nursing was their most competitive program. And so, they graduated, I think less than, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but probably 25% of the people that started. So having a competitive spirit, I was like, I can do that, and so I went into nursing, and I had a great experience at the school. It was a small school in Connecticut. It's in the same town as Yale. So I did have the opportunity as well. Some of our faculty taught at Yale as well as at Southern, the school that I went to. So I really had the opportunity to engage in kind of higher level education and Ivy League education, all while I was, in a small state school. So it was fabulous. And then when I graduated, I was the first new graduate hired in the cardiothoracic ICU at Yale. And which was, I was very, very fortunate to have that opportunity. I had an amazing mentor who really helped me kind of develop my nursing skills in this incredibly complex environment. I'll date myself a little and say that at the time, stents were not even, they came into the market when I was a nurse, and we were like, oh, that's never going to work,
Right.
We did the first heart transplant, the first heart lung transplant, the first single lung transplant, first time using this advanced hemodialysis kind of technique, BiVADs, like stuff that, really was unheard of. So I had an incredible experience to start my career.
Wow, that's fascinating. And coming from your parents, that sounds like you had a very strong foundation in terms of empowering you to go after what you wanted. And your mom, it sounds like your mom played a pretty pivotal part in that with three girls. Yeah. It sounds like she was quite a role model for that.
Yeah, she, she's really interesting. And at the time, she was very engaged in politics and as a member of the Board of Education and on, some town committees in town and stuff. And so I do think, she probably had more of an influence on me than I generally give her credit for. So hopefully she'll watch this and she'll get her credit after all these years.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. But my dad was also, my dad unfortunately was killed when he was young, but he just was a very powerful influence in our lives because I think not having a boy, I kind of was his boy a little bit. But I was incredibly fortunate throughout, we had a large family, large extended Italian family. absolutely was like a village. So
Hmm.
I had influence on me, not only from my mom and dad, but from my grandpa, who was, an amazing, amazing role model. And then from my uncles. I mean, they were all different. One was an educator and one was a contractor. And, so all of them influenced and contributed to kind of who I was. And to some extent, there's a lot of people ask, like, what was that point at which you kind of hit the wall, and I think one of the things was that I was raised to believe that I can do anything and that I was special.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of went into the world thinking that, which is a gift and a curse.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when I talk about like what was the biggest wall that you hit, it was recognizing that other people are good also. And so that was definitely a lesson in humility that came not just once, but numerous times throughout my career.
So, Lori, as an ER nurse, after graduating, did you go right into ER nursing? Was it your first step, or?
No, right into cardiothoracic, and then from there into ER. So the cardiothoracic ICU first, and then into the ER from there.
So you went to Yale, and that was your first role. How was that experience, and at what point did you start getting curious about the crossover into the industry side?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were, at the time, let me think about this. So I was just, thinking about what was going to be the next step in my career, and I had applied to the master's program at Yale. I was super excited about that. My cousin was in the Yale Law School, and it was like, oh, this will be great. We can kind of graduate together. And my husband came home and told me that we were being relocated to Atlanta.
Ah.
And I remember thinking, ooh, that's not going to work, because, I'm getting ready to go and get my master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so I called my dad, and again, back to the old, traditional roots. He was like, oh, honey, you can't, your husband's the breadwinner. You can't, not do this. You have to follow him. And so I was like, oh yeah, okay. So we were relocated to Atlanta, and worked at a hospital there, went to Emory. And then we're pregnant with our first child. And so after I had my first child, I started teaching at one of the universities down there, kind of as a part-time instructor, faculty member. And then I had my second child, and then I was like, oh, maybe I'll go into education. And so I'm going to pursue going back to that, to the university. So I was actually on the phone to apply to Emory for their program, and I got a call from a company that somebody had given them my name and said that I would be a good clinical specialist, and was I interested? And I hadn't really considered that. I had thought about industry a little bit, but I was really in the pharma side of it, because that's what I saw people doing. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And so I went ahead and pursued it. And it was with a company called Datascope, who I knew very well, the balloon pumps. And there was a woman there at the time who was their head of their clinical department. And she was so impressive. And every time I'd seen her, I thought, gosh, I'd love to be like her. So she was super impressive. So I went through the interview process, and I got the job. I literally got the job at the first interview. And then I had to decide if I wanted to do it, because it was going to be covering 7 states as a clinical specialist all over the United States. My children at the time were 7 and 4. So I had to really think about, could I do this? So my husband and I discussed it. My husband's probably the most supportive person in the world. And he was like, yeah, do it. He's like, we'll figure it out. So I did. And it was the best thing that I had ever done, because not only was it very fulfilling professionally, it was where I felt my calling was, but from a family perspective, it allowed us to blend our roles. So for the first time, we had very traditional marriage, very traditional roles. I worked as a nurse part-time, took care of the children. He worked full-time, in a big career. And this was an opportunity for us to kind of blend those roles and become a partner in how we parented our children, which my children will both tell you is thankfully a positive, because they got their dad's influence instead of just mine, because of we're very opposite in terms of how we approach things. So it was great. And I kind of jumped right in. I was a clinical specialist for about a year. And then, I'd kind of figured out some business things. I had an amazing mentor at the time, lots of mentors, great manager. And I, immediately saw kind of opportunities to kind of expand this business. And I went to them and explained how I thought things should be done. And I ended up getting promoted to salesperson, then had a really successful sales career, and then got promoted to area manager. And so it just kind of, just went. It became kind of my life, really my dream.
Those oldest child traits, the oldest child traits that you were concerned about early on ended up becoming quite the asset as you continued to accelerate. Yeah, and that's not uncommon. What's interesting about what you have done is that transition from, again, that really strong clinical foundation, and then sliding in and stepping in, and then accelerating on the leadership side. From the clinical perspective, what do you think best prepared you for industry in terms of your experiences in the hospital?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I get asked that question a lot, and the parallels are just extraordinary because, first of all, as a clinician, specifically in critical care, you're asked to make decisions very quickly with very little information.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've had conversations with managers before where, they're questioning me, and I'm like, listen, if we lose $1 million, on a $1 billion business, that's a rounding error. If I make a bad decision and somebody dies, that's a major big deal, So I think decision-making capability and understanding how to integrate kind of key components of the story to ensure that you're making the best, most, well-informed decision. I think the concept of kind of multitasking, as a critical care nurse, you're managing a whole host of different things from a practical perspective and a medical perspective. But then you're also, from a leadership perspective, you're dealing with people at their most vulnerable. So their families, this is something that doesn't happen all the time in people's lives. Mm-hmm. So when they're in the ICU, there's psychosocial issues, there's, family dynamic issues, there's obviously medical issues, there's science issues. You're really dealing with kind of the whole person. And I think that that's really helped me to look at people as a more comprehensive body, as opposed to just who they are at work, what's going on in their family, and what are those family dynamics. And then I think the third thing is if we had a patient that wasn't doing well, we had to call a cardiac surgeon, 3:00 in the morning and compel them to come in, right? And they're at home in their warm, cozy beds, and this nurse is calling them. So I think it really taught me how to build a business case, because if you've got to compel a cardiac surgeon to come in the middle of the night and look at your patient, you better have all the facts and data that create that business case to allow them to come in, and some strong negotiation skills, because specifically back then, cardiac surgeons were, they were tough. And so I think I learned very quickly, how to be concise, how to articulate a point, and then how to compel them to kind of come in and make a decision that was required for that patient to be, able to be helped.
That's fascinating. And I can see how clear it is now with your successes and how well you've done, especially in the entrepreneurial environment, once you've transitioned into the entrepreneurial environment, where you do have moving parts, and depending on the moment, you have to move into one function of the business and engage another and incite another, and bring different facets along. That is fascinating. Were there any surprises moving into medtech that you didn't expect? You had seen what we do, what the industry does, what it looks like from the outside as a customer, as a clinician, and then moving into the industry. You had seen, you said the head of Datascope was someone you really admired, and said that was a powerful mentor. Yeah. What do you reflect on and say, boy, that was a bit of a surprise. I wish someone had teed me up for that a little bit better, or I wish I knew more about it before I made that jump.
Yeah. The whole, and I'll call it this because I think it is encompassing kind of the political ecosystem that happens within companies. In nursing, it really, it's just not, I'm sure in some areas of nursing it is, but when you're working in a cardiothoracic ICU or an ER, you're all partners. It's very collaborative. You say there's no, there's really, I hate to say no limits, but you say what needs to be said because it's for the best of the patient. You're taking care of people when they're getting ready to die. So if you're in a code situation or you're in a really critical situation and you're cracking someone's chest, there's no politics or hierarchy. It's like, okay, I've got this, you've got that, we need fluid. Everyone's kind of working together, and you're not thinking about what you say or how you're acting or anything like that. When I went into med tech, suddenly it was like, you had to be worried about what you said. Things, I remember I sent an email, I was upset about something, and I sent an email to everyone who I thought needed to know this, that I was upset. And my boss, got back to me and he said, well, Lori, that was grandstanding. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, I don't even know what that means. I said, I'm just like, they needed to hear this, like this, and he was awesome. And he kind of sat me down and explained to me why, the impact that my message had and why that was probably not an appropriate choice, and what grandstanding actually meant, and how, people can become sensitive. And so I think for me, it was that humility I talked about earlier of recognizing that, there's lots of people that are good at what they do. It's not just me. And that I need to find ways to work with people, to not insult them or not to overpower them, or kind of to work in the constraints, and I think there's a balance, right? So I think you don't want to become so politicized that it's bureaucratic and things can't get done. But by the same token, you kind of can't be all the way as an independent, entity. So that was probably my biggest surprise and my biggest challenge, initially transitioning.
And that mentor, I'll call him that called you on your email and gave you the constructive feedback, that's invaluable. How did you begin that relationship? Was that an organic relationship that you knew someone and got involved, or how did that happen?
I think one of the things is that I've always been really fortunate in all but probably one or two instances where I have had really supportive managers that I've kind of built those relationships with by being kind of honest and transparent and building trust. And I think with this gentleman specifically, I think, I had worked with him. I think he saw who I was. And I think that I was honest. I was not afraid to, if you gave me feedback and said that I was acting like an idiot or whatever, I never kind of fought that back. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that. Like, tell me more. So I think my openness and willingness to be vulnerable, to laugh at myself, and to say, I messed up, I'm sorry, I think really, really helped build that relationship. But like I said, I think he was one of many who just, I think, saw that, I call it all the time, purity of intention. I think he saw that my intent was pure, and he recognized that. And I think he realized that I just needed that help, and I was kind of open to receiving it. So I think that really helped. And to this day, we still talk and communicate, and I value his opinion very, very much.
And as a leader now, I'm sure you have mentored and grown so many individuals. When you see what anyone who's within 10 seconds of you sees is this unbridled passion and infectious enthusiasm for what you do, that we can't teach. So that is a natural. And then you throw on the fact that you're coachable and you do have the thick skin to be able to handle it, and you're strong. That, I'm sure, was something that stood out at the time. And that's obviously why you've grown as well as you have. As a sales and commercial leader, as you grew through an industry and you made the transition, one thing about you that I admire is not only your successes, you always made culture an important component. And I'm curious, because we've talked about this, and some of the things that you've done highlight your focus on culture. Were there any lessons learned early that created that importance of culture for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that because, and sometimes I kind of tease about this, most of the time, actually, when I've been promoted, it's because it's bad, right? There's just, and there's a lot written about, women leadership generally get those roles when there's no one else that's going to do it. But I definitely have been tasked with situations that things were just kind of falling apart. And I realized very early on, again, through mentorship and different leadership that I had, that if you don't have a strong culture or an environment of kind of trust and collaboration, and accountability, you can't get anything done, and so, part of that, I think I would say I learned because I'm a voracious reader. Part of it I've learned because, like I said, I've had some really good mentors. And part of it I've learned because you can just watch it. You start to see it unfold. I think I'm pretty intuitive when I see things. So culture always became a really big part of everything I've done, is to say, okay, how can we kind of take a step back and build a culture that's super strong? And culture doesn't just happen. So while I consider myself ultimately successful in transitioning culture, I'm sure I've also built cultures that were not as, or contributed to cultures that were not as productive. But I recognize it. And that's what I always say, like, I know when it's happening, and then I'm working really diligently to unwind it. But at the end of the day, you can have the best strategy in the world, the best product in the world, but if the culture is not sound and strong, you're just not going to be successful. So that's what I've always focused on and committed to, is how can I help lead a transformation of a culture, and how can I ensure that that culture facilitates and enables strategy and business to happen. So that's probably kind of generic, but I think it gives a good understanding of what I really have been focused on. And so, one of the things, I have a acronym for how I like to believe from a value perspective, and it's called, put your coat on. And so my values are communication, ownership, accountability, and trust. And those are the 4 things that I really focus on. And so I had someone that worked for me one time, when I was talking about those, said, oh, here's the acronym, COAT. You put your coat on when you come to work. And I was like, I love it. And so I've used it with that, with our coat of arms. We did a coat of arms with the coat, but they're so fundamental. And what I've found is they're so absent so many times. Those basic principles of how do we communicate, how do we take ownership, how do we drive accountability, and how do we build an environment of trust where we can mess up and still kind of work successfully.
What advice would you give the individual who may be in a larger organization, or an organization that's on the rails, and the culture really does need to be renovated? There's some serious gaps there. And so often I hear, you can't turn the Titanic. It's just so big, and it's so much, it's so beyond. And that's why so many of the people that lean in and want to chat are looking to leave, because they feel that they don't have the ability to influence. Any thoughts for someone who may be in that boat? They're in otherwise a good company. They're behind the product. They're behind the mission. The culture is just, it needs help, right? There's serious gaps there.
So that's a great question. And I'm probably a terrible person to ask that, because as my husband would say, my biggest strength is my fatal flaw, and that I am an eternal optimist. And I believe that I can fix anything, so when I'm faced with a bad culture, or a culture that doesn't work, I will kill myself trying to change it myself with the people that of my influence, so of myself and my people of immediate influence. I know when people are in toxic cultures, it eats away at you. I had an experience like that once, and to the point where I ended up having 2 cardiac caths at 50 years old from the pressure of this really, really toxic culture. And finally, the second time, my cardiologist just said to me, he's like, Lori, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. You eat well, you're this healthy person, and you are literally having cardiac symptoms from the stress. Like, you need to leave. I wouldn't leave. I was not going to leave until I did what I said that I was going to do, at my own peril.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I say I'm probably not the best person to say that. But on the optimistic side, on the positive side, I do think that you can craft a culture within your sphere of influence. And if you can do that successfully, people learn so much more by what they see than by what you say.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned that along the way. Like, I say a lot of things, I think sometimes, that are great and make a lot of sense, but then, we're all human and we can fall away from that. And so I'm constantly having to ensure that what I say and what I do are aligned, but I do think that there's power in each one of us coming to work, bringing our full selves, and changing the culture to where we want it to be within our sphere of influence. And then it's like, what's that old Fabergé commercial, right? And then they tell two friends, and so on and so on and so on. And it really can grow. And, that experience that I shared with the heart issue, and I stayed, I did build a positive culture, which has lasted today with relationships and growth, within a smaller sphere of influence that I had. And so that's what kind of got me through it and kept me, healthy, and got me to the point where I did what I went to do. I committed and I executed and I delivered, and then I was able to leave.
That's excellent.
I don't know, like I said,
that's excellent. No, and that hits on exactly what I know to be unique about you, because that leadership quality, it comes naturally for you. And those who are aspiring to get there, it sounds to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds to me you started with your core circle of stakeholders in the same challenge.
Right.
And you engaged and got them on board with, look, this is what I'd like to do. And then they in turn got others involved. And now at some point it becomes the overarching vibe of the organization. It becomes what they stand for. It becomes your coat, as that becomes who you are and your mission. And that is, it may seem daunting, but and because you've done it, and it's not magic, right? It took hard work, and it took baby steps, and it took buy-in, and it was engaging and getting each of them to act. So those steps are critical. And as a leader, how have you, now that you've gravitated towards smaller companies, do you find it now easier because you can set the tone culturally from the beginning? Or are the steps the same? How would you?
The steps are the same. It's really interesting. I think the steps are the same because I can, as the head of the company, I can technically just say, this is what we're going to do, right? It doesn't change it. So it doesn't change it if you're sitting at the top, second, middle, or low. You still have to gain influence. You still have people who have their own perspective and their own experience and their own insights, and you kind of have to lead them. And believe me, like I said, one thing when you said earlier, going through the process, failure is a big part of it also. There are certain people that I have failed as a leader, that we didn't connect and they weren't part of it. And I didn't do a good enough job bringing them along or letting them go. Back to the Jim Collins, Good to Great, sometimes people need to leave the bus. They're not in the right seat on the right bus. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It just means they're not fitting your culture. And I think that that's the one thing that I've absolutely over the years learned. Not that I want to surround myself with people who think like me or, are going to be minions, any stretch of the imagination. But you've got to surround yourself with people that are able to kind of embrace what you're trying to bring and can argue and disagree with respect, but still feel that they're, valued. Mm-hmm. And that's not easy. Mm-hmm. That's probably the hardest part. And then making those decisions quickly, but ensuring, you're making a decision for somebody and you're basically, removing them from their role. That's not an easy decision. I take that very seriously. That person's livelihood, that person's ego, all of that is considered in it. But in the end, if you can do it graciously and you can do it with what I call love and acceptance and humility, those people will go on to be incredibly successful. They just weren't successful with you. And that's okay. That's okay. You know, anyway, so I think that's the piece of it, is really understanding how do you influence people and how do you bring them along, not just because you have positional leadership, but you have influential leadership. And that's the part where you have to be vulnerable, and people see you without your clothes on, and and they don't always love it, but it's part of who we are, and we just have to kind of accept that. And it was hard for me at first, because when I very first started in leadership, I didn't want to be criticized. I was beloved as a child. My family loved me and thought everything I did was great. And then suddenly strangers don't see that. And now in the age of social media and all of that, people have comments about everything. So you have to kind of get that thick skin, that humility, and that understanding of purity of intention to really kind of move past that and be able to embrace that, so that you can help people kind of move through it and follow. So, and get them off the bus if they don't fit. It's the best for everyone. It really is the best for everyone. And some people are just not successful in certain environments, and that's okay. That's what we have to aspire to, is where can we find our success, and what environment is best for us to contribute at our maximum value.
Was getting good at that assessment a acceleration, or was it a cliff? Was it something that there was a turning point where you had an employee that was not appropriate, and you learned your lesson and said, from now on, I'm going to think differently? Or was it something where you looked at a team and you looked at perhaps patterns? I'm sharing this because, again, aspiring leaders, people who are looking to make these decisions as effectively as possible, if there's warning signs that aren't slamming into a wall, or perhaps that's the only warning sign, it would be interesting to hear what you experienced.
I would say it's a combination of both. So I think, and it's funny, and I always say, my husband's my biggest mentor supporter. If he were sitting here, he would be like, okay, stop right here. She's done this so many times and she knows it, and she still lets it happen. And then I would tell him, that's not true. You don't understand. But the point is that it's happened, not a lot, but it certainly happened, in different situations. And again, going back to my strength and my weakness, is I'm an optimist, right? So I want to believe, and I'm a nurse. So nursing, you generally think you can help everybody, And so I always want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And because I'm self-critical, I will look at where I failed that person as well. And so I'll spend time kind of trying to repair that, trying to bring them along. But I'm not perfect, and I make mistakes. And then I get to a point where I'm done, and that's not good. So it was a gradual learning of a cliff that happened with somebody recently, where within 30 days, I realized they were not the right person, and they just didn't click. They didn't like me. It was obvious they didn't like me. Their body language showed they didn't like me. Their behavior showed they didn't like me, but they were a key member of our team, and everybody else noticed it. And this person and myself, it became divisive. But I rationalized it because I thought, well, this person's a good person. They bring the right experience, and I kept trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the point where it was like, okay, this isn't working, And at that point, I realized I promise I am never going to do that again, because I finally saw all these kind of other examples that culminated in this one where I said, I did it again, and now I know that it's really important that you have the right people on your team, not the right minions, not the right people that just say what you want, but the people that are going to be committed to your ultimate mission. And so that's why I think it's a combination of this gradual learning and then a cliff where I just saw it. And in fact, I would argue that it ultimately hurt the company. It ultimately hurt the company and put us in a position where we had to make decisions that we should not have had to make because of this. And, without getting into the detail. And that's where I makes me physically sick, but
Well,
it's part of it.
and you learned, right? And that's where
Right.
you got your strength in terms of making decisions downrange. This is where we
Right.
make our
Right.
changes, and I
Yeah.
see it as, from where I sit, all the time. 50% or 51% is cultural fit. The other
Yeah.
49 is experience.
Exactly.
I see it all the time. The right experience can be the wrong hire.
Exactly.
So it's it's very, very poignant point. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that, and I'm very curious, because you're now with this exciting young company. What trends in the industry are you excited about, and what things that you and your team are working on? What are you most excited about over the next few years?
Yeah. So like we said, we were talking, so in the space that we're in, I think it's super exciting because there's still, believe it or not, after all these years, amputations are still a major problem for peripheral vascular disease. And so we're really focused on peripheral vascular disease right now. And we have a device that can help save patients from having amputations. So today, 500 people a day lose their leg based on peripheral artery disease. And that's really predicated on, the increasing and unprecedented rate of diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, obesity, all of the things that America is dealing with. So from our company perspective, we're thrilled to death because we have a device that can break the calcium in the arteries that leads to what's called chronic limb ischemia, which ultimately results in an amputation because there's no way to restore flow to those limbs. And it's most prevalent in the underserved populations of women, African American, and Hispanic. So I'm excited to kind of put together a program where we really focus on those underserved populations and improve quality of care for them and ensure that they can get perfusion back into their extremities. So that's what we're working on, which we're super excited about. And then from an industry perspective, I think the whole concept of value-based care, I think is super exciting. And I'm starting to finally, we've been talking about it forever, right? The triple aim of healthcare was conceptual to kind of somewhat pragmatic to now we're kind of getting to that, where it really is being applied. And I see it. I see that if you can have a net health outcome for a patient, that's going to be where care is going to go. And so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about us finally kind of moving into that. Also, I just sat through a seminar the other day that shared the statistic that from medtech perspective this year, so biotech, medtech combo, there were like 56 IPOs and they expect to be 65 by the end of the year, which is kind of unprecedented. And there's been, I think it was $12 billion is the number that they gave invested in these companies. So I think we're really investing in innovation. And then I think, not to get political at all, but I think the election's really gonna be telling because this past administration has made working with the FDA and CMS, and even in terms of, venture capital investment, really lucrative. I mean, the FDA has never been easier to work with. The CMS, Seema Verma has done an amazing job with being kind of industry friendly, and lots of the different, things that they put in place, the proposed rules are really helping to support innovation. So I'm hoping that that's going to continue because I think it's been a real boon for kind of med tech. So I think med tech's exciting. And then I think the last thing I'll say is that, while certainly there's been a lot of untoward things with COVID, I think it's switched the focus now on the smaller companies, because and I saw this at one of the seminars that I went to, and they talked about how if you have a smaller startup med tech with a really good product, a good leadership team, and you know how to manage cash, money is being and support is being diverted to that more so, and there's more stability than there are in kind of the big med tech companies. And so I think that there's hopefully that's going to be an exciting trend that continues.
Oh, we're seeing that firsthand too.
Yeah.
To be in a pandemic year and have our best year revenue-wise to date, it's unreal. Right. It's unreal. Yeah. The investment that's turning into innovation is fantastic. And you're right, the timing and the FDA's openness to where we're at and the emerging technologies overall having a better floor and a better podium to stand on. It's certainly helping all of us that focus more on entrepreneurial organizations. So.
And I think that there's also going to be a trend towards stronger leadership because, you know, I think it's Warren Buffett that said, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked.
That's right.
And, you know, right. And
yes.
so you think about that, like there's been a lot of, you know, through the heyday of med tech, there's been some probably not so dynamic qualified leaders. And I think that we're going to start to see an emergence of, you know, the newer, younger, you know, leaders that can handle paradox and handle ambiguity and really create, you know, cultural change and business change. And so I'm excited to see that because I do think there's going to be a transformation in the next 3 to 5 years, kind of away from that old guard into kind of a more, you know, more friendly, business friendly, you know, interesting type of leadership. So I'm excited about that also.
Yeah, no, and it adds up to the entire picture of whether a company has the opportunity to be successful. It's no longer exclusively about a cool product with a big market. There's the product. Can we get it reimbursed? And yes, we have more green lights these days than we have in the past. The leadership is heavily scrutinized always, right? So now even more so. So yeah, it's an exciting time. And well, I'm thrilled to have had you today. This is terrific. Your shares with the audience is invaluable. Excited to watch what happens next with Soundbite and your success here, and we will be staying in touch. Thank you very much for joining us today, Lori.
Thank you. Thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us on the Power Curve. We'll see you next time.